A gang of bikers stormed a quiet farm, mocking the aging farmer and tearing down his cherished flag. "Stay in your place, old man," their leader sneered, confident in his power. But they had no idea who they were dealing with, or the reckoning that awaited them. And it all began like this. On the outskirts of a small Wyoming town, where everyone knew each other by name, lived a humble farmer named Thomas Wainwright. His small farm was tucked away from the main road with neat rows of corn, a lively chicken coop, and a sturdy, though aging, pickup truck parked by the garage. Tom rarely ventured far from his land, and the local children loved visiting him, listening to his stories, and playing with his loyal dog, Rex, a massive, gentle creature who kept watch over the farm. The day began like any other, with the golden light of dawn and the soothing hum of morning chores. Tom was mending a fence near the road, straightening a crooked board, when the rumble of engines interrupted the tranquility. A column of motorcycles appeared on the horizon, kicking up dust as they approached. The roar of their engines grew louder until it drowned out the chirping birds and rustling leaves. The bikes stopped abruptly near the farm, forming a semicircle. 5 men dismounted, each wearing leather jackets, and smirks that could only be described as arrogant. The leader of the group, a tall man with a booming voice named Rick Thunder, stepped forward with his hands clasped behind his back, surveying the scene like a king inspecting his domain. Well, Grandpa, is this your estate?" Rick drawled mockingly, rocking on his heels. "Tell me, don't you get tired of living in the Stone Age? Maybe it's time to move into the 21st century." Tom slowly looked up, putting down his hammer, and met Rick's gaze. "For me, this place beats the 21st century any day," Tom replied evenly, adjusting his straw hat. Something about Tom's calm demeanor irked Rick. He stepped forward, snatched the hat off Tom's head, and tossed it into the dirt. "There, now it matches your barn," Rick bellowed with laughter. Tom didn't respond. He bent down, picked up the hat, dusted it off, and placed it back on his head. His calm reaction only fueled the gang's laughter. To them, he was just an old man, meek, harmless, and easy to intimidate. "Hey boys, it's a little boring around here. Let's liven things up," Rick announced, turning to his gang. Chaos ensued. One of the bikers revved his engine and tore through the cornfield, flattening stalks as he went. Another approached the pickup truck and, with a smug grin, kicked in one of the tires. "Hey, old man, got a spare, or should I bring one from town?" the biker taunted over his shoulder. Chickens scattered in every direction as a third biker flailed his arms and shouted, pretending to chase them. The gang's boisterous laughter and the roar of engines filled the air, a cacophony of destruction. Tom stood motionless, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the chaos unfold. His neighbors, like Mr. Miller, drove by cautiously, stopping at a safe distance to witness the scene. Seeing the wreckage and the gang's antics, Mr. Miller nervously adjusted his glasses and whispered to his wife, "I hope Tom can handle this, but what can he do?" When the bikers had their fill of tormenting the farm, they mounted their motorcycles again. Rick, turning to Tom with a smirk, called out, "Don't worry, Grandpa, we'll be back. Fun place you got here." The roar of engines faded as the gang rode off, leaving behind a battered fence, a flattened cornfield, and a slashed truck tire. Tom exhaled slowly, his eyes scanning the remnants of what had once been a peaceful morning. Without a word, he returned to his tasks, but his gaze, cold, steady, and resolute, betrayed a shift. Rex stood by the road, watching the retreating bikes, his ears perked as if waiting for a signal. Tom finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "Well, Rex, let's get to work." He reached for his tools, the calm resolve in his tone, hinting at something far beyond simple repairs. A few days passed, and the sound of engines echoed down the dirt road once again. This time, the gang was larger. A dozen bikers rolled up to Tom's farm, their laughter booming and their behavior even more brazen. They parked their bikes haphazardly on his lawn, leaving tire marks on the grass. One biker revved his engine unnecessarily loud, startling the chickens again, while another mockingly examined the cornfield as if he were a food critic. Rick Thunder swaggered up to the porch, his leather jacket creaking as he moved. He sniffed the air dramatically and wrinkled his nose. "Still smells like the 1800s around here," he sneered, glancing at the old house. "Nice little house you got, Grandpa. But you know what it's missing?" He paused theatrically, his gang leaning in with exaggerated anticipation. "Some color?" He snapped his fingers, and one of the bikers pulled a can of spray paint from his saddlebag. With a grin, the man walked to the barn and began scrawling graffiti across the weathered wood, the hiss of the can slicing through the stillness. Tom, who had been working quietly on his truck, stood up and walked toward them. His calm demeanor didn't falter, even as another biker picked up a rock and hurled it through the barn window. The shattering glass sent a ripple of murmurs through the few neighbors watching from behind curtains or parked cars a safe distance away. "You boys might want to leave," Tom said evenly, his voice cutting through the noise. He fixed his gaze on Rick, who was leaning against a fence post with a smirk. Rick chuckled and stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "And what are you going to do? Call the cops?" His voice was dripping with mockery. He leaned in closer, giving Tom a small shove on the shoulder. Tom staggered back but didn't fall. He straightened himself, brushed off his shirt, and met Rick's gaze again. "I'm telling you," he said quietly, "leave now, before you regret staying." Rick laughed, a loud, boisterous sound that echoed across the property. "Regret? That's cute, old man. Real cute." Another biker picked up a hammer from Tom's toolbox and started banging on the fence. Two more were ripping down the laundry that had been hung to dry, using the clean clothes to wipe the dust off their bikes. One even tried to climb onto the roof of the chicken coop, sending the birds into a frenzy of squawking and flapping. Tom stood his ground, his expression unreadable, as if calculating. His silence seemed to unnerve one of the younger bikers, who muttered, Rick, maybe we should—" "Shut it," Rick snapped, cutting him off. "The old man isn't going to do anything." From a distance, Mr. Miller, Tom's nearest neighbor, sat in his car with the engine idling. His wife clutched his arm nervously. "We should call someone," she whispered. "What's the point?" Mr. Miller sighed, shaking his head. "It'll take too long, and by the time anyone gets here—" He trailed off, glancing toward Tom. "Still, he's handling this a lot better than I would." The chaos escalated. The bikers broke another fence panel, threw tools into the dirt, and tore down a small flag hanging near the porch. One of them went as far as to tip over a planter that Tom's late wife had once cherished, spilling its soil and flowers across the steps. For the first time, a flicker of something, anger perhaps, crossed Tom's face. Rick, oblivious to this shift, leaned casually on his bike, watching the destruction with satisfaction. "You're a real sport, old man," he called out, clapping his hands. "We'll come back in a few days. Make sure it's just as fun next time." The gang revved their engines, filling the air with noise and dust as they rode off, leaving Tom's farm in ruins. The fence was broken, the barn defaced, and the yard strewn with debris. Tom stood in the middle of the chaos, surveying the damage with a calm expression that didn't match the destruction around him. Rex sat quietly at his side, his ears perked, watching the road. Tom knelt down, patting the dog on the head. His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it now, like the first crack in a dam. "They think they're having fun, Rex," he said softly. "They've got no idea what's coming." Rex wagged his tail once, as if in agreement. From behind the curtains of nearby houses, neighbors watched in silence, sensing that something had shifted, not in the bikers, but in Tom. And for the first time, the quiet farmer didn't seem quite so ordinary. The next day, the roar of engines echoed down the dusty road yet again. The bikers arrived with the same cocky swagger, their loud banter and revving motors cutting through the morning calm. This time, they brought even more riders, confident that their intimidation tactics would meet no resistance. Rick Thunder dismounted his bike with a grin, brushing imaginary dust off his leather jacket as he sauntered toward the house. But when his gaze fell on the porch, his grin faltered. Standing at the top of the steps, Tom was no longer the unassuming farmer they had encountered before. Dressed in a meticulously pressed camouflage uniform, his boots shining and his posture commanding, he looked like someone entirely different. His gaze was sharp, almost piercing, and his presence exuded quiet authority. Rex sat dutifully at his side, his eyes fixed on the intruders. Rick laughed nervously, trying to cover his unease. "What's this, Grandpa? Decided to play soldier for us?" He gestured to the uniform mockingly, eliciting a few chuckles from his gang. "You trying to scare us?" Tom didn't respond. Instead, he took a step forward, his calm gaze never leaving Rick. "Let me introduce you to some old friends of mine," Tom said evenly. From behind the house, figures began to emerge. One by one, tall, broad-shouldered men stepped into view, each clad in fatigues or military-style gear. Their movements were deliberate, their eyes scanning the bikers with practiced precision. It was clear from their composure that these weren't just friends. These were men who had seen action, men who knew exactly how to handle a situation like this. The laughter died in Rick's throat as the gang watched, stunned. One of the veterans, a hulking man with a salt and pepper beard, approached Rick's bike. With an almost casual motion, he placed a hand on the handlebars and tipped the bike onto its side with a loud crash. "Oops," the man said with a smirk. "Looks like your toy fell over." The younger bikers began to shift uneasily, their bravado draining away as the realization set in. They were outmatched. Rick tried to regain control of the situation, his voice rising in forced confidence. "All right, old man, you've got your buddies here, so what? You think this is gonna—" Before he could finish, Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver object. He held it up for everyone to see, a military badge, polished to a shine. "Tom Wainwright," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Colonel, former Special Forces commander, and yes, I do have a plan for you boys." Rick's face turned pale as he glanced around at the men surrounding him, each one now standing at strategic points, blocking any potential escape routes. "Look," Rick stammered, his confidence crumbling. "We didn't mean anything by it, just having some fun, that's all." Tom stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. He tilted his head slightly, his calm demeanor still intact. "Fun, you say?" Tom asked, his tone almost conversational. "Well, let me show you what fun looks like for people like us." One of the veterans leaned against a fence post, arms crossed, and added, "We've got plenty of ways to keep you entertained." The gang, sensing no way out, began to back away toward their bikes, but the veterans closed in just enough to stop them without laying a hand on anyone. "You can start," Tom said, "by fixing everything you broke yesterday." His tone left no room for argument. "And then we'll talk about your apology." The bikers hesitated, glancing at Rick, who looked more like a cornered animal than the confident leader they had followed. Seeing no other option, he muttered, "All right, fine, we'll do it." The veterans stepped aside, allowing the gang to gather tools and begin repairing the damage. One by one, they hammered nails back into the fence, scrubbed spray paint off the barn, and swept debris from the yard under the watchful eyes of Tom and his comrades. As the sun climbed higher, the scene became almost comical. Hardened bikers, covered in sweat and dirt, worked in awkward silence, occasionally glancing nervously at the veterans who stood like sentinels, silently supervising. By the time they were done, Rick approached Tom with a look of forced humility. "We're sorry," he muttered, barely audible. Tom leaned in slightly, raising an eyebrow. "What was that?" Rick swallowed hard and repeated louder this time, "We're sorry." Tom nodded, finally allowing a small smile to break through his stern expression. "Good. Now get out of here. And if I ever see you near this farm again—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the unspoken warning hung heavily in the air. The gang scrambled onto their bikes and roared off down the road, leaving nothing but a cloud of dust behind. As the veterans began to disperse, one of them clapped Tom on the shoulder. "Still got it, Colonel," he said with a grin. Tom chuckled softly and turned to Rex, who wagged his tail in approval. "Well, boy," Tom said, scratching the dog behind the ears, "I think we'll finally get some peace and quiet around here." And with that, Tom walked back toward his house, the faint hum of laughter from his old friends following him as they disappeared down the road. Under the firm supervision of Tom and his former comrades, the bikers were put to work. Gone was their bravado, replaced by reluctant obedience. They trudged around the property, fixing the damage they had caused while the veterans watched their every move. Rick and his gang, now reduced to clumsy laborers, hammered nails into the broken fence, scrubbing graffiti off the barn, and even sweeping up debris from the cornfield. One particularly unlucky biker was assigned to clean the chicken coop, emerging later with feathers in his hair and a sour expression on his face. The veterans, who had formed a perimeter around the farm, occasionally offered pointed suggestions. "That board's still loose," one said, pointing with a calm but authoritative tone. "Make sure you get all the paint off or you'll be starting over," added another. The bikers grumbled under their breath, but none dared to argue. Rick, meanwhile, was tasked with repainting the barn. The irony of this wasn't lost on him, especially when Tom handed him the brush with a faint smirk. "Since you're such a fan of adding color, let's see how good you are with even coats," Tom remarked. As the gang worked, the neighbors began to gather, cautiously at first. A few stood on the edges of their lawns, murmuring among themselves. Some held up phones, recording the surreal sight of the once intimidating bikers being ordered around like scolded children. Mrs. Turner, the town's gossip, stood near the fence with her phone out, narrating the scene for her online followers. "You won't believe this, folks. The Wainwright farm is the talk of the town today. Look at those bikers fixing the mess they made. Karma, am I right?" As the day wore on and the repairs neared completion, Rick stood before Tom, looking every bit as defeated as the rest of his gang. His leather jacket was smeared with paint, his boots covered in dirt. He hesitated for a moment, then finally muttered, "We're sorry, sir. We didn't know." Tom raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Didn't know because you didn't ask," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Now you do, and if I ever see you or your boys on my land again." Tom let the sentence hang in the air, unfinished. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. Rick swallowed hard, nodding. "Understood," he mumbled. The bikers mounted their motorcycles, which looked less imposing now, and rode off in silence. The cloud of dust they left behind was the only trace of their presence. As the veterans began to pack up and head out, a ripple of applause broke out among the gathered neighbors. Someone shouted, "Way to go, Tom," while others clapped and cheered. A few even approached to shake his hand, offering words of admiration. One young man, holding his phone up, grinned and said, "This is going viral, Mr. Wainwright. You're about to be a local legend." Tom chuckled, shaking his head as he looked down at Rex, who was wagging his tail enthusiastically. "Well, boy," Tom said, scratching behind the dog's ears, "looks like we've made quite the impression." The sun began to set over the freshly repaired farm, casting a warm glow over the house, the barn, and the rows of corn. Tom walked back to the porch, his steps steady and deliberate. He paused, taking one last look at the now peaceful scene. "Guess I've still got it," he said with a faint smile, giving Rex one last pat before heading inside. And so, life on the Wainwright farm returned to its quiet routine. But everyone in the town, and perhaps beyond, now knew better than to mistake Tom's calm demeanor for weakness. Behind that quiet strength lay a force not to be underestimated.